I'm Will Yeoman, and welcome to another edition of Pod Street Writing WA's official podcast. And today it's my pleasure to introduce Anthea Hodgson, who is the author of 3 books so far, the latest of which is The War Nurses. Now, I should say, Anthea, where are we sitting at the moment? Just outside Museum Boulevard.
Yeah.
It's beautiful, isn't it?
Gorgeous spot. Yeah, lovely quiet corner, having a coffee. It's a beautiful place to talk.
And a beautiful day too.
Yeah.
The sun is shining.
Yep.
Which, again, we're so fortunate to be able to enjoy a coffee like this.
We are.
There's so much going on in the world that is very unpleasant.
We've got a very safe and happy country, and we're lucky to be here.
Indeed.
Yeah.
So, look, first of all, a little bit about yourself before we get stuck into the War Nurses.
Yep. My name is obviously Anthea Hodgson. I'm a WA girl. I'm from Wheatbelt, WA. My schooling was here in Perth. And I'm a writer now. I worked in radio as a younger woman, but I now am a writer, and I've published a couple of novels which were rural romances with Penguin, and I've moved into historical fiction because I wanted to tell the story of my great aunt Minnie.
Now, as we were just saying before we started recording, this is such a different novel from those previous 2 books. I mean, I guess a lot of listeners would be familiar with the whole rural romance genre, or chocolate as some other people call it.
Yeah.
I mean, this is probably about as far as you can get yet.
Yep.
It is still very much character driven. It's still about people. It's got romance in it. It's also got tragedy, obviously, but the basis is in fact, and again, it's, as you pointed out, it's very personal. So tell us why it was so important for you to write this story.
Well, as you say, it is a big departure from the rurals, but it is also a continuation of me writing about family, because those rurals were very much about my family, my hometown, my farm, my friends,
of course,
all sewn into that. And so that's very much family stories for me, but with obviously the rural romance written over the top. And this is very similar. This is a story I grew up knowing about my Aunt Minnie, who was murdered in the Bangka Island massacre in World War II. And so I grew up knowing that story, and I don't think I had appreciated the significance of that story until I grew older and had my own children. And at Anzac Day, I would tell them the story of their great aunt, because I wanted to bring it alive to them as children. And the story of these wonderful women and the incredible Irene Drummond, the matron who said that incredible quote on the beach, that moved me so much when I was telling my children that it still makes me weep. And when I was telling them, I think that stayed with them. And so I remember telling my little daughter that story as I've told her the story at Anzac Day. And I must have been driving them somewhere where they had to be very brave. And as we were driving, I said, we must be very brave. I must have been the dentist. And Ord sang out from the back seat and said, like Auntie Bullwinkle. And when I questioned her more closely, she said, who was so brave on the beach? And I knew that story had stayed with her. And so then it became really important to me to tell the story of these incredible women, because I felt that they had been a little forgotten. I went to the same school as Minnie down here in Perth, and she was not mentioned, and nor would we have expected her to be mentioned, because we didn't appreciate what this story meant to us as a nation and as a family. And so it became really important to me. And so I'd done a couple of rurals which I'd really enjoyed, but I became really obsessed with writing this story, and I spent too long writing it because I wrote it upside down and backwards, and I had to stay with it because I made the mistake of putting the photos of 8 of those nurses up beside my desk. And once they were there, I couldn't take them down and I couldn't give up. And so, this story is a family story, but it's also a national story.
Yes, and it's interesting that you've chosen to tell it as fiction, and you've therefore... a lot of the central characters are in fact fictional characters, but they're representative of the whole, because there are a lot of women like this.
That was a really, and when I'm talking about how difficult it was to write, that was a deliberate decision. And I often tell groups when I'm speaking to them that I'm trying to trick them, because I'm trying to trick them into reading about a difficult history. And by doing that, I'm trying to make them think, I'll read this story about these girls who go away to war. They will read it as a fiction, knowing that it's a history, but each of those nurses will have an arc, because history is just things that happen in order. And if you're interested in history, that's fine for you. But I think most people would like to know the story, but they don't just want to read things in order. So that was my first reason for fictionalising the nurses as far as I have. But also, I think when you read history, for a lot of people, it's an intellectual pursuit, and you're remembering facts and figures, and you're going, oh, this is what happened and that's what happened. I want people to take these nurses into their heart, and I want them to respond emotionally to the story, because I think that's how you remember it and that's how it stays with you. And certainly that's been the case with me. And so I'm sort of trying to push my love of these women onto my reader, and I think I can only do that by using fiction, because I think fiction gets into your heart. And so that's what I was trying to do. So I have nudged stories, and I have compiled stories onto nurses that it wasn't actually their story, but there's 65 nurses, and you'll go insane if I try and tell all of their stories. And so I'm trying to select anecdotes and to select stories that will bring to life these wonderful women and the incredible history that they either survived or didn't survive, because some of those girls came back, a lot of them didn't.
Yeah. I guess we should at this point give a little bit more context about the story. So clearly World War II.
Yep.
This theatre of war very close to home in terms of where Australia is and so forth. Obviously, it touches a lot on the Japanese and their role in World War II. But these Australian nurses, I mean, it's an extraordinary story any way you look at it. Yeah. How did this even come about? What were they doing there?
Well, they were sent out from Australia. They left from Sydney on the Queen Mary, which had been turned into an army ship, and they were taken up there pre-attack of the Japanese. But we suspected something was going to happen, obviously, because the war was heating up in the Pacific, and there were tensions already between the Americans and the Japanese. The attack on Malaya, as it was, didn't happen for another year. So those nurses were there nursing, and they were mainly just dealing with skin complaints and stomach complaints and stuff. And they were having quite a social time, but not doing the actual war nursing that they were there for.
Yes.
Until Pearl Harbor happened, and then the next day the Japanese attacked high on the Malayan Peninsula. And as we know, they came down really, really quickly, which was unexpected. And the British had their Singapore harbour there, and all their guns were pointing out, because they always had assumed they'd be attacked from the front. Of course, they were wrong. Within a month, 6 weeks, everyone was starting to get evacuated, which they again delayed because they were arrogant and didn't think it would ever happen. So the nurses were refusing to leave their patients, but eventually were being sent out on ships. The Vyner Brooke, they were told it was not a suitable ship. There was nothing else. So these 65 nurses, plus women, children and injured soldiers, were on the ship. There were about 44 ships that tried to get through the South China Sea, and only 4 of them made it. So they were constantly being bombed. It was known as Bomb Alley, and these nurses were bombed. During the bombing, 12 of the nurses died during that time, either drowned or were cut down by the gunfire. Then the nurses were on separate rafts. They came into an island called Bangka Island. They came in at separate times. The first group of nurses to come in included my Aunt Minnie and Vivian Bullwinkle, and they set up a fire. You would think they would be the lucky ones, but the next groups that came in went into the camps. And so those nurses were in camps in Muntok and Sumatra for the rest of the war, and of those girls, 8 of the nurses died during the duration of the war. And then the nurses on the Raji Beach massacre, they had decided they had to surrender to the Japanese. When the Japanese came to take their surrender, they took the soldiers around the headland in 2 groups and bayoneted them, and came back to the nurses, who then held hands, and a machine gun was set up, and they were forced to walk into the water where they were machine gunned. And that wonderful quote that I've referred to from matron Irene Drummond, which was a large part of inspiring me to write this book, was that she called out to the girls and she said, "Chin up, girls, I'm proud of you and I love you all." And I thought that was such an incredible act of bravery and love in her last moments that I had to write the book.
Absolutely, and that's one certainly quote that does stay with you.
Absolutely. And that was in the writing of the book, that was such a big part of it for me.
Yes.
But of course, structurally, it was a problem because that had happened back in 1942,
yes,
and the war didn't end for years, but I couldn't bear to have that quote there. So for a while, when I had written this out, I just wrote it out as a history. And then I wanted to split it up because I wanted the quote at the end of the book, so yes, I kind of interspersed those timelines, which kind of didn't work. And so my publisher quite rightly said, we're going to have to come back, but you can still have that at the end.
Yes, okay.
Because to me that sort of encapsulates the whole vibe of those nurses.
Totally, yeah.
So I really wanted that at the end.
Yeah. I mean, look, that sort of leads me to ask more about the challenge of writing this as a novel, because you pretty much know this is not going to be a feel-good story.
It is a feel-good story, and I refuse to believe it's not. It is.
No, look, it is in terms of the inspiration, the hope, the story.
Relationship between those women.
You're right, I shouldn't have said that. Okay.
It leaves me feeling very proud, very moved.
Let's put it in a different way then.
Go.
It's not...
It's not a love riot.
How can I say it? Oh, right. It's not...
It's hard.
Everyone rides off into the sunset alive and happy.
No.
It's not that kind of story.
No.
Okay.
Correct. No, I will
gotcha.
agree. I will agree with that. I do agree with that.
So yet we do want everyone to read this book.
Yeah.
So I'm just guessing there was that challenge. How do we make this the kind of book that people are attracted to, they want to read, even though it is in many ways going to be a little bit of a tough read.
Well, at times really hard.
Yes.
Yeah, at times really hard, and I do agree with that.
Yes.
And as I say, when I was writing it, I found it really hard to write because a lot of the things that happened to the nurses was incredibly difficult to write and really traumatic.
Yes.
I've had to take stuff out and leave stuff out because as you're right when you say commercial fiction, I want people to read it and not just people who are super into war or super into history. I want a general reader to read it and appreciate it. And so that was my challenge, because when I'm writing about what the nurses go through, for starters, they have this incredible spirit and sense of humour, and some of the jokes in there are actually theirs. So they do have this relationship and this attitude of looking after each other and putting each other first, which I found really inspiring. So I want that to come through. But for that to come through, I need to make it clear to the reader just how bad things were and just how real the threat to them was. So when they are worried about being raped and murdered, it's not because they are nervous types. It's because they're aware that nurses have been raped and murdered in Hong Kong.
Yes.
They know that it's a possibility.
Yes.
And when they are suffering through those 3.5 years in the camps and not knowing whether it will end, assuming that they will die and be forgotten in the jungle, when things are getting worse and worse, I need the reader to know how bad it is, because I want them to know how brave they were and how strong they were in the face of that. But the other problem with that is the Japanese are wonderful people and they are our friends now, and I don't want this to be a hate-filled book. So at the same time as wanting my reader to see the suffering, I also don't want it to be so extreme that it's hate-filled for the Japanese people, because that's not where we are, and it's not the sort of book I want to write. So it's been a balancing act, because I want you to appreciate what these women went through, but I don't want to demonise the Japanese.
Of course, yeah. So a lot of plate spinning there. You know, there's a lot of of different sort of...
Yeah, that's right. That and trying to embroider, because so much of what I was reading, a couple of them were first-person narratives from the actual nurses, White Coolies and While History Passed.
Yes.
And so there were lots of really cool anecdotes and stories and moments of love and lightness that came through. And I was really desperate to get those in. And so any of the little stories that are in there, or anecdotes that people will think I've made up, I really haven't. But that's the stuff that made it human to me. Because I think if you're a history buff, you probably want to read, how big was the ship and blah, blah, blah. I want to read who are these nurses and how did they interact. So when a nurse is reading out part of a cheesy romance novel because she knows it's going to irritate another one, that's true. That was real. And when they're borrowing the Marie Curie book that's in Dutch from the library, that's true. All the little bits in it are true, because I think that's the humanity of the story for me.
Absolutely.
The relationship with those women and what they were willing to do to survive.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that in the afterword too, so that people understood that they were all real. Yeah, because that makes it even more sort of moving, I think, and authentic. Yeah. You're not just embellishing as a fiction writer. It's actually happened.
Yeah, that's the thing. And so when the man loses his glasses, or when the yellow cardigan is left in the wheel, it's all true. And even as I've read, because I rarely read back, because I find it either a bit much or there's so much I want to change, because I've worked on this book for so long. But when I've had to read back, because every now and again someone wants me to do a reading from the book, I read bits that I've forgotten that I wrote, and I go, oh yeah, that's true, I didn't make that. Oh, that's true. Oh, that's true. And I want to tell people all of this stuff is actually true, and it's surprising even me, because there was so much in there.
Absolutely. So I was thinking too, when you talked about writing commercial fiction, that there could have been a third option. There could have been straight up and down history, so non-fiction, commercial fiction, which you've done, and then there could have been, I'm guessing, a more literary approach, which would have had the effect of a certain distancing, which is maybe why you didn't go down that route? I mean, because, you read so many of these books and they're more interested in style and all those kinds of things that we associate with a different kind of book.
Yes.
Is that something you'd even thought about or contemplated? Or
Look, a little bit, but very much, and I think I hope I've achieved it, very much I want you sitting by the fire and I want you throwing yourself off the Vyner Brooke.
Absolutely.
And so I want to be more invisible than that. I think once you're writing in that more literary style, I think the writing and the author is more front of mind for the reader, and I want to disappear. Right. I want us all to be holding hands on the beach. I want us all to be shoveling out the latrines or watching the Dutch lady run away from Lipstick Larry. So I want it to be commercial because I kind of want to disappear a little bit, and I want those women to be the stars of the show, and I want it to be an easy read. And often we say in writing, hard write, easy read, and this was a hard write. So I'm hoping it's an easy read, and I've heard from readers who have said that they really raced through it because it was such an easy read.
Which is exactly what you want. And you're right. It's there's nothing that comes between you.
Yeah, I hope so.
And the characters. Good. And I think it's also vivid. You're really painting those pictures.
Oh, that's good. Yeah,
so
that's a relief because it is hard to... And because I was writing for so long, it's hard to know if that's coming through or if that's working or not working, because you end up in this crazy tent by yourself going, I think this is good, but I can't tell.
Yeah.
And so to find it connecting with people is really satisfying and an enormous relief, because you're alone with that book for a long time, and I was alone with this book for a long time.
Okay. Now, look, you've already partly answered this question in what you've already said, but how has writing this novel and seeing it through to publication changed you as a person?
Oh, wow. I don't know. That's hard. I think I've got a renewed respect for these people and for that whole generation, because I am discovering more and more stories of families who went through a lot. So I think it has made me more appreciative of that whole generation. I used to work in talkback radio, and we used to get calls from a lot of that generation, and they were always quite unpleasant and quite racist. I don't get it, but I understand where that's coming from, and I think that generation has now left us. But I get that anger and that bitterness and that whole... The mood of Australia was so anti at that time, and I understand that. So I think I have more space to understand the history that went on in that, and also the connectedness of all of our stories.
Yes.
And I think this is one example of one event that happened, but gee, it affected a lot of Australia. So I think it's made me feel more connected to everyone's history and to everyone's family story. Personally, it's also, I think... It's given me a lot of satisfaction, and I often say to people, if I never write anything else, I won't regret that, because I got to write this book. And so I think just personally it's given me enormous satisfaction, not even in a career way, but just in a personal way, that once someone sprinkles me somewhere, that I've left this behind, because I really felt like, and at the time we said we wouldn't forget these nurses, but we kind of did. I'm pleased to have brought it to more people. So I think I'm a more satisfied person.
No, that's lovely. Before we forget, publisher, where is it available?
It's available most places. Quite a few Dimmicks still have it. It's gone into Target and Big Dubs. It's available online.
It's Penguin Random House,
it's with
correct?
Penguin, Penguin
okay,
Random
so
House.
People can get it anywhere.
And they've just done it. Yeah, they've done a reprint, so it will still be around.
Which is fantastic. Yeah. So, given what you've just said about this as being kind of the way you talk about it, it's like the pinnacle of your achievement. But so it begs the question: where to next?
Look, I'm going to Kalgoorlie next. I'm going to have some fun. I hope I'm going to have some fun. Having said that, I'll keep on talking about murder. I'm going to Kalgoorlie, and I'm writing turn of the century gold rush with prostitutes and gold theft and murder. And I'm going to have some fun. And I'm going to allow myself a little bit more leeway. With this one, I had to be spot on in terms of what happened. As you quite rightly say, the history of these nurses has happened, and I wasn't going to change it. So I had to write within that history. But there are some fantastic sex workers who came to WA following the gold, and they've got some amazing stories. And then there was a murder in 1926 of two policemen, Pittman and Walsh, and I've just been to the graves of the two men who were hanged for that murder. But gold theft was huge at the time,
right.
And so it will be gold theft, it will be prostitutions, brothels, containment, which was specific to WA. It'll be all those things. So that's where I'm doing.
So, is it a murder mystery? Is it a...
No, I don't know if it's a murder mystery.
You've got all the elements there. It is a bit.
It is a bit.
You know.
So I think, and it hasn't gone this far yet, so who knows. I think it's going to be dual timeline, but only between, say, 1897 and 1926.
Okay.
And it is going to be a bit of a murder mystery, even though if you wanted to look it up in Wikipedia, you could work out who done it, because I've just told you they're buried in Freo. But I think it will be that sort of thing,
sure.
because certainly they're involved in trackers trying to find where the original crime scene was, because the two bodies were not there. So there will be a mystery element through it, yeah.
It's so interesting, because you think about a writer like Dave Wish-Wilson, who explores similar territory, but much, much later. Like the late 70s, early 80s.
Yeah.
You know, the prostitutes, the organised crime.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
It's really interesting to have this perspective going back a bit further.
Yeah, I'm really interested. Like, everything I'm reading is too interesting, frankly, because I've now got about 5 kilos of books that I have to wade through, and I love every story that I'm reading, and I've got my favourite prostitutes already. So yeah, I've got to try and whittle it down.
Fascinating. Anything else? Any other side projects? Have you got any time at all for anything else? Or is
No, that's kind of it, I've got to say. Those two things I would like to get more into a rom-com, because I like comedy and I want to do something lighter. So
sure.
I'm sort of thinking during my holidays, we're going to Bali, and I'm thinking I might have a few bintangs. Write something lighter as well, just for a bit of relief. But I feel like the sex workers are going to provide a bit of light relief as well, because some parts of their lives were grim, but I think there would be that camaraderie and
You're
those women's
right.
stories again.
I think, which is again not dissimilar to the territory you've been exploring here.
Yeah, I feel like that there will be a link between those, because I think those girls will have to have looked after each other as well in really tough conditions, and from all around the world. So I feel like there will be great stories there.
Well, I'm very much looking forward to that one.
Yeah, thank you. I'm looking forward to having written it, not the writing part.
Okay, Anthony, well, thank you so much for joining us on Pod Street.
Thanks,
it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you.
Thanks very much.
And good luck with the continued success of the War Nurses.
Thank you very much.